And then I will start. It's been a long time since I've streamed, and these past few months have probably been the busiest. Probably the busiest I've ever had in my entire life. So, that is why. But we are on chapter 45, the Ramr River. And let me just do a few things here. Cool. Alright. So when we left off last time, Aragorn had turned he turned dirt, or I think it was sand, one of the two, into water. It nearly killed him, but he figured that it would just be a lot easier to draw water out of the ground, because it'd be the equivalent of lifting it, than to actually transmute something. And we're on chapter 45, the Ramr River. They forced themselves to rise early in the great pre-dawn hours. Aragorn shivered in the cool air. How are we going to transport the elf? She can't ride on Saphira's back much longer without getting sores from her scales. Saphira can't carry her in her claws. It tires her and makes landing dangerous. A sled won't work. It would get battered to pieces while we ride, and I don't want the horses slowed by the weight of another person. Murtagh considered the matter as he saddled Tornak. If you were to ride Saphira, we could lash the elf onto Snowfire, but we'd have the same problem with sores. I have a solution, said Saphira unexpectedly. Why don't you tie the elf to my belly? I'll still be able to move freely, and she will be safer than anywhere else. The only danger will be if soldiers shoot arrows at me, but I can easily fly above those. None of them could come up with a better idea, so they quickly adopted hers. Aragorn folded one of his blankets in half lengthwise, securing it around the elf's petite form, then took her to Saphira. Blankets and spare clothes were sacrificed from ropes long enough to encircle Saphira's girth. With those ropes, the elf was tied back first against Saphira's belly, her head between Saphira's front legs. Aragorn looked critically at their handiwork. I'm afraid your scales might rub against the ropes. We'll have to check them occasionally for fraying, commented Murtagh. Shall we go? Saphira asked, and Aragorn repeated the question. Murtagh's eyes sparkled dangerously, a tight smile lifting his lips. He glanced back at the way they had come, where smoke from soldiers' camps was clearly visible, and said, I always did like races. And now we are in it for our lives. Murtagh swung onto Tornak's saddle, trotted out of the camp. Aragorn followed close behind on Snowfire. Saphira jumped into the air with the elf. She flew low to the ground to avoid being seen by the soldiers. In this fashion, the three of them made their way southeast, towards the distant Hadarac Desert. Aragorn kept a quick eye out for pursuers as he rode. His mind repeatedly wandered back to the elf. An elf! He'd actually seen one, and she was with him. He wondered what Roran would think of that. It struck him that if he had ever returned to Carvajal, then he would have a hard time convincing anyone that his adventures had actually occurred. For the rest of the day, Aragorn and Murtagh sped through the land, ignoring discomfort and fatigue. They drove the horses as hard as they could without killing them. Sometimes they dismounted and ran on foot to give Tornak and Snowfire a rest. Only twice did they stop, both times to let the horses eat and drink. Though the soldiers of Gilead were far behind now, Aragorn and Murtagh found themselves having to avoid new soldiers every time they passed a town or village. Somehow the alarm had been sent ahead of them. Twice they were nearly ambushed along the trail, escaping only because Saphira had happened to smell the men ahead of them. After the second incident, they avoided the trail entirely. Dusk softened the countryside as evening drew a black cloak across the sky. Through the night they traveled, relentlessly pacing out the miles. In the deepest hours of night, the ground rose beneath them to form low, cactus-dotted hills. Murtagh pointed forward. There's a town, Bullridge, some leagues ahead that we might bypass. They're sure to have soldiers watching for us. We should try to slip past them now while it's dark. After 3 hours, they saw the straw yellow lanterns of Bull Ridge. A web of soldiers patrolled between the fires, scattered around the town. Aragon and Murtagh muffled their sword sheaths, and carefully dismounted. They led the horses in a wide detour around Bull Ridge, listening attentively to avoid stumbling on any equipment. On an encampment, with the town behind them, Aragon relaxed slightly. Daybreak finally flooded the sky with a delicate blush and warmed the chilly night air. They halted on the crest of a hill to observe their surroundings. The Ramr River was to their left, but it was also 5 miles to their right. The river continued south for several leagues, then doubled back on itself in a narrow loop before curving west. They had covered over 16 leagues in one day. Aragon leaned against Snowfire's neck, happy with the distance they had gone. "Let's find a gully or a hollow where we can sleep undisturbed." They stopped at a small stand of juniper trees, and laid their blankets beneath them. Saphira waited patiently as they untied the elf from her belly. "I'll take the first watch and wake you in mid-morning," said Murtagh, setting his bare sword across his knee. Aragon mumbled his assent and pulled the blankets over his shoulders. Nightfall found them worn and drowsy, but determined to continue. As they prepared to leave, warm and drowsy, Saphira observed to Aragon, "This is the 3rd night since we rescued you from Gilead, and the elf still hasn't woken. I'm worried. And," she continued, "she has neither drunk nor eaten in that time. I know little of elves, but she is slender, and I doubt she can survive much longer without nourishment." "What's wrong?" asked Murtagh over Tornak's back. "The elf," said Aragon, looking down at her. "Saphira is troubled that she hasn't woken or eaten. It disturbs me, too. I healed her wounds, at least on the surface, but it doesn't seem to have done her any good." "Maybe the shade tampered with her mind," suggested Murtagh. "Then we have to help her." Murtagh knelt by the elf. He examined her intently, then shook his head and stood. "As far as I can tell, she's only sleeping. It seems as if I could wake her with a word or touch, yet she slumbers on. Her coma might be something elves self-induced to escape the pain of injury. But if so, why doesn't she end it? There's no danger to her now." "But does she know that?" asked Aragon quietly. Murtagh put a hand on his shoulder. "This must wait. We have to leave now or risk losing our hard-won lead. You can tend to her later when we stop." "One thing first," said Aragon. He soaked a rag, then squeezed the cloth so water dripped between the elf's sculpted lips. He did that several times and dabbed above her straight, angled eyebrows, feeling oddly protective. They headed through the hills, avoiding the tops for fear of being spotted by sentries. Saphira stayed with them on the ground for the same reason. Despite her bulk, she was stealthy. Only her tail could be heard scraping over the ground, like a thick blue snake. Eventually, the sky brightened in the east. The morning star, Ideal, appeared as they reached the edge of a steep bank covered with mounds of brush. Water roared below it, and it tore over boulders and sluiced through branches. "The Ramr," said Aragon over the noise. Murtagh nodded. "Yes, we have to find a place to ford safely." "That isn't necessary," said Saphira. "I can carry you across, no matter how wide the river is." Aragon looked up at her blue-gray form. "What about the horses? We can't leave them behind. They're too heavy for you to lift." "As long as you're not on them and they don't struggle too much, I'm sure I can carry them. If I can dodge arrows with 3 people on my back, I can certainly fly a horse in a straight line over a river." "I believe you, but let's not attempt it unless we have to. It's too dangerous." She clambered down the embankment. "We can't afford to squander time here." Aragon followed her, leading Snowfire. The bank came to an abrupt end at the Ramr, where the river ran dark and swift. White mist wafted up from the water, like blood steaming in winter. It was impossible to see the far side. Murtagh tossed a branch into the torrent and watched it race away, bobbing on the rough water. "How deep do you think that is?" asked Aragon. "I can't tell. said Murtaugh, worry coloring his voice. Can you see how far across it is with magic? I don't think so, not without lighting this place up like a beacon. With a gust of air, Saphira took off and soared over the Ramr. After a short time, she said, I'm on the other bank. The river is over a half-mile wide. You couldn't have chosen the worst place to cross. The river bends at this point and is at its widest. A half-mile! Exclaimed Aragon. He told Murtaugh about Saphira's offer to fly them. I'd rather not try it for the horse's sake. Tornak isn't accustomed to Saphira's snowfire. He might panic and injure them both. Ask Saphira to look for shallows where we can swim over safely. If there aren't any within a mile in either direction, then I suppose she can ferry us. At Aragon's request, Saphira agreed to search for a ford. While she explored, they hunkered next to the horses and ate dry bread. It was not long before Saphira returned, her velvet wings whispering in the early dawn sky. The water is both deep and strong, upstream as well as downstream. Once he was told, Murtaugh said, I better go over first so I can watch the horses. He scrambled onto Saphira's saddle. Be careful with Tornak. I've had him for many years. I don't want anything to happen to him. Then Saphira took off. When she returned, the unconscious elf had been untied from her belly. Aragon led Tornak to Saphira, ignoring the horse's low whinnies. Saphira reared back on her high haunches to grasp the horse around the belly with her forelegs. Aragon eyed her formidable claws, then said, Wait! He repositioned Tornak's saddle blanket, strapping it to the horse's belly so it protected his soft underside, then gestured for Saphira to proceed. Tornak snorted in fright and tried to bolt when Saphira's forelegs clamped around his sides, but she held him tightly. The horse rolled his eyes wildly, the whites rimming his dilated pupils. Aragon tried to gentle Tornak with his mind, but the horse's panic resisted his touch. Before Tornak could try to escape again, Saphira jumped skyward, her hind legs thrusting her with such force that her claws gouged the rocks underneath. Her wings strained furiously, struggling to lift the enormous load. For a moment it seemed she would fall back to the ground. Then, with a huge lunge, she shot into the air. Tornak screamed in terror, kicking and tossing. It was a terrible sound, like screeching metal. Aragon swore, wondering if anyone was close enough to hear. You better hurry, Saphira. He listened for soldiers as he waited, scanning an inky landscape for telltale flash of torches. It soon met his eye as a line of horsemen sliding down the bluff almost a league away. As Saphira landed, Aragon brought Snowfire to her. Murtaugh's silly animal was in hysterics. He had to tie Tornak down to prevent him from running away. She gripped Snowfire and carried him off, ignoring the horse's trumpeted protestations. Aragon watched her go, feeling lonely in the night. The horsemen were only 1 mile away. Finally, Saphira came for him, and they were soon on firm ground once more. With the Ramr to their backs, once the horses were calmed and the saddles readjusted, they resumed their flight towards the Bur Mountains. The air filled with the calls of birds waking to a new day. Aragon dozed even when waking. He was barely aware that Murtaugh was just as drowsy. There were times when neither of them guided the horses, and it was only Saphira's vigilance that kept them on course. Eventually the ground became soft and gave way under their feet, forcing them to halt. The sun was high overhead. The Ramr River was no more than a fuzzy line behind them. They had reached the Hadarac Desert. Chapter 46. The Hadarac Desert. Let me get some water. A vast expanse of dunes spread to the horizon like ripples on an ocean. Bursts of wind twirled the reddish gold sand into the air. Scraggly trees grew on scattered patches of solid ground any farmer would have declared unfit for crops. Rising in the distance was a line of purple crags. The imposing desolation was barren of any animals, except for a bird gliding on the zephyrs. You're sure we'll find food for the horses out here? Queried Aragon, slurring his words. Hot, dry air stung his throat. See those? Asked Murtaugh, indicating the crags. Grass grows around them. It's short and tough, but the horses will find it sufficient. I hope you're right, said Aragon, squinting at the sun. Before we continue, let's rest. My mind is slow as a snail. I can barely move my legs. They untied the elf from Saphira, ate, then lay in the shadow of a dune for a nap. As Aragon settled into the sand, Saphira coiled up next to him and spread her wings over them. "This is a wondrous place," she said. "I could spend years here and not notice the passing time." Aragon closed his eyes. "It would be a nice place to fly," he agreed drowsily. "Not only that, I feel as though I was made for this desert. It has the space I need, mountains where I could roost, and camouflaged prey that I could spend days hunting. And the warmth, cold, does not disturb me. But this heat makes me feel alive and full of energy." She craned her head towards the sky, stretching happily. "You like it that much?" mumbled Aragon. "Yes." "Then when this is all done, perhaps we can return." He drifted into a slumber even as he spoke. Saphira was pleased and hummed gently, while he and Murtagh rested. It was the morning of the 4th day since leaving Gilead. They had already covered 35 leagues. They slept just long enough to clear their minds and rest the horses. No soldiers could be seen to the rear, but that did not lull them into slowing their pace. They knew that the Empire would keep searching until they were far beyond the king's reach. Aragon said, "Couriers must have carried news of my escape to Galbatorix. He would have alerted the Razak. I'm sure they're on our trail by now. It'll take them a while to catch us even by flying, but we should be ready for them at all times. And this time they will find that I am not so easily bound with chains," said Saphira. Murtagh scratched his chin. "I hope they won't be able to follow us past Bull Ridge. The Ramr was an effective way to lose those pursuers, so it's a good chance our tracks won't be found again." "Something to hope for indeed," said Aragon as he checked the elf. Her condition was unchanged. She still did not react to his ministrations. "I place no faith in luck right now, though. The Razak could be on our trail even as we speak." At sunset, they arrived in the crags they had viewed from afar the previous morning. The imposing stone bluffs towered over them, casting thin shadows. The surrounding area was free of dunes for half a mile. Heat assailed Aragon like a physical blow as he dismounted Snowfire into the baked, cracked ground. The back of his neck and his face were sunburned. His skin was hot and feverish. After picketing the horses where they could nibble sparse grass, Murtagh started a small fire. "How do you think it went?" Aragon asked, releasing the elf from Saphira. "I don't know," snapped Murtagh. His skin was red, his eyes bloodshot. He picked up a pot and muttered a curse. "We don't have enough water, and the horses have to drink." Aragon was just as irritated by the heat and dryness, but he held his temper in check. "Bring the horses." Saphira dug a hole for him with her claws. Then he closed his eyes, releasing the spell. Though the ground was parched, there was enough moisture for the plants to live on, and enough for him to fill the hole several times over. Murtagh refilled the water skins as water pooled into the hole, then stood aside and let the horses drink. The thirsty animals quaffed gallons. Aragon was forced to draw the liquid from even deeper in the earth to satisfy their desire. It taxed his strength to the limit. When the horses were finally sated, he said to Saphira, "If you need a drink, take it now." Her head snaked around him as she took 2 long draughts, but no more, before letting the water flow back into the ground. Aragon gulped down as much as he could, then watched the last drops melt back into the earth. Holding the water on the surface was harder than he expected. But at least it's within my abilities, he reflected, remembering with some amusement how he had once struggled to lift even a pebble. It was freezing when they rose the next day. The sand had a pink hue in the morning light, and the sky was hazy, concealing the horizon. Murtagh's mood had not improved with sleep, and Aragon found his own rapidly deteriorating. During breakfast, he asked, "Do you think it will be long before we leave the desert?" Murtagh glowered. "We're only crossing a small section of it, so I can't imagine it'll take us more than 2 or 3 days. Look how far we've come already." "All right, maybe it won't. All I care about right now is getting out of the Hadarac as quickly as possible. What we're doing is hard enough without having to pick sand from our eyes every few minutes." They finished eating, then Aragon went to the elf. She lay as one dead, a corpse except for her measured breathing. "Where lies your injury?" whispered Aragon, brushing a strand of hair from her face. How can you sleep like this and yet live? The image of her alerted and poised in the prison cell was still vivid in his mind. Troubled, he prepared the elf for travel, then saddled and mounted Snowfire. As they left the camp, a line of dark smudges became visible on the horizon, indistinct in the hazy air. Murtagh thought they were distant hills. Aragorn was not convinced, but he could make out no details. The elf's plight filled his thoughts. He was sure that something had to be done to help her or she would die, though he knew not what that might be. Saphira was just as concerned. They talked about it for hours, but neither of them knew enough about healing to solve the problem confronting them. At midday, they stopped for a brief rest. When they resumed their journey, Aragorn noticed that the haze had thinned since morning, and the distant smudges had gained definition. No longer were they indistinct purple-blue lumps, but rather a broad forest-covered mounds with clear outlines. The air above them was pale white, bleached of its usual hue. All colors seemed to have been leached out of the horizontal band of sky that lay on top of the hills and extended to the horizon's edge. He stared, puzzled. But the more he tried to make sense of it, the more confused he became. He blinked and shook his head, thinking that it must be some illusion of the desert air. Yet when he opened his eyes, the annoying incongruity was still there. Indeed, the whiteness blanketed half the sky before them. Sure that something was terribly wrong, he started to point this out to Murtagh and Saphira when he suddenly understood what he was seeing. What they had taken to be hills were actually the bases of gigantic mountains, scores of miles wide. Except for the dense forest along their lower regions, the mountains were entirely covered with snow and ice. It was this that had deceived Aragorn into thinking the sky was white. He craned back his neck, searching for the peaks, but they were not visible. The mountains stretched up into the sky until they faded from sight. Narrow, jagged valleys and ridges nearly touched split the mountains like deep gorges. It was like a ragged, toothy wall linking a glacier with the heavens. There's no end to them, he thought, awestruck. Stories that mentioned the Boar Mountains always noted their size, but he had discounted such reports as fanciful embellishments. Now, however, he was forced to acknowledge their authenticity. Sensing his wonder and surprise, Saphira followed his gaze with her own. Within a few seconds, she recognized the mountains for what they were. I feel like a hatchling again. Compared to them, even I feel small. We must be at the edge of the desert, said Aragorn. It's only taken 2 days, and we can already see far, far beyond. Saphira spiraled above the dunes. Yes, but considering the size of those peaks, they could still be 50 leagues from here. It's hard to gauge distances against something so immense. Wouldn't they be a perfect hiding place for the elves or the Varden? You could hide more than the elves and the Varden, he stated. Entire nations could exist in there in secret, hidden from the Empire. Imagine living with those behemoths looming over you. He guided Snowfire to Murtagh and pointed, grinning. What? Grunted Murtagh, scanning the land. Look closely, urged Aragorn. Murtagh peered closely at the horizon. He shrugged. What? I don't... The words died in his mouth and gave way to a slack-jawed wonder. Murtagh shook his head, muttering, That's impossible. He squinted so hard the corners of his eyes crinkled. He shook his head again. I knew the Burr Mountains were large, but not that monstrous size. Let's hope the animals that live there aren't in proportion to the mountains, said Aragorn lightly. Murtagh smiled. It will be good to find some shade and spend a few weeks in leisure. I've had enough of this forced march. I'm tired too, admitted Aragorn. But I don't want to stop until the elf is cured or she dies. I don't see how continuing to travel will help her, said Murtagh gravely. A bed will do her more good than hanging underneath Saphira all day. Aragorn shrugged. Maybe when we reach the mountains, I could take her to Serta. It's not that far. There must be a healer there who can help her. We certainly can. Murtagh shaded his eyes with his hand and stared at the mountains. We can talk about it later. For now, our goal is to reach the bears. There, at least the Razak will have trouble finding us, and we will be safe from the Empire. As the day wore on, the Bear Mountains seemed to get no closer, though the landscape changed dramatically. The sand slowly transformed from loose grains of reddish hue to hard-packed, dusky cream dirt. In place of ruins were ragged parches of plants, and deep furrows into the ground where flooding had occurred. A cool breeze wafted through the air, bringing welcome refreshment. The horses sensed the change of climate and hurried forward eagerly. When evening subdued the sun, the mountain's foothills were a mere league away. Herds of gazelles bounded through the lush fields of waving grass. Aragon caught Saphira eyeing them hungrily. They camped by a stream, relieved to be out of the punishing Hadarac Desert. And that is the end of that for now. And I will read the rest at a later date.